But why not?
This is a question from Tim Holmes, and for those who aren't aware, I'm sure a quick bit of Googling will explain that Clay wrote about a heat sink.
Heat sink, yes.
And the idea was that as the UK industrialised, we couldn't cope with the shift from country life to urban life, and the way we dealt with it was to get very drunk for a long time. And only when we stopped being drunk did we start building these great institutions, the education systems, the health services. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but your explanation of television is that certainly for the last sort of 40, 50 years, that's been our version of gin, as we've shifted again into a new, the information age, I guess. And it's been our way of coping with...
Yes. Now, one asterisk on that is it's not so much the fact of gin and the fact of television, it's the fact of the gin craze. The hard thing to explain is not why people drink gin. It's quite tasty. The hard thing to explain is why in the early 1700s gin consumption went through the roof. And it went through the roof mainly in London, which was the city that was whose population density was expanding most dramatically. It wasn't a rural phenomenon, and it was only a minor phenomenon in the industrial centers of the Midlands. It was really where the population density was growing. And in a way, and the same thing is true of television. The hard thing to explain is not why people watch television. There's some funny stuff on, there's some interesting stuff on, why not? It's why did it become a half-time job for every citizen of the industrialized world? Why is it 20 hours a week for everyone to a first approximation in industrialized nations? And so it's the gin craze and the 20 hours a week of television watching that needs explaining, not gin itself and television itself. Yeah. I'm sorry, and so the question was?
The question was, what's next in the sequence? Gin, TV, then what?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know, because in fact there are long periods in which there is none of that kind of dissipation. What I think, what was next in the sequence, interestingly, about the gin craze, is that there were 30 years in which Parliament essentially tried to put the cork back in the bottle, both literally and figuratively. They said, they passed all of these laws essentially trying to replicate the morals and behaviors of pre-industrial society. In particular, people were scandalized that women were drinking gin, right? And this, no good could come of this, as you can imagine, the thought at the time. And it was really only 30 years later, in the 1750s, when there was a kind of capitulation on all sides, that there was not going to be any way to preserve the pre-industrial environment of London, that in fact civic institutions were going to have to be developed that dealt with the fact that there were all of these people living cheek by jowl in what had been, certainly not a sleepy little town, but what had been a fraction of its size by 1750. There is a similar sense among, there's a group of kind of on the scale, sort of pessimist to Luddite writers. Nick Carr is the only one of that group actually worth paying attention to, but there's a bunch of them, Gorman, Keane, Bierkerts, Lee Siegel, all of whom have the same rough attitude, which I'm not against digital technology per se, I just think we should acquire only as much of it as won't change society. And that seems to me to be almost exactly the attitude of Parliament in the 1720s, which is, we want to regulate this to the point that it doesn't change anything. What we'd really like to do is hold on to what we're familiar with and take only sort of little advantageous slices of the new. And it seems to me that what's at the end, not of television itself, but at the end of, I'm going to watch television 20 hours a week, is participatory media that rewards not just consumption but also production and sharing. And what we're entering into now, I mean, again, now in the sense of a historical generation, is a massive period of experimentation with what kinds of amateur production and what kinds of global sharing actually work well. Because we're leaving the environment where human contact was largely limited to family and business, and we're entering a world where at least the potential is human contact is limited mainly by the choice of the avenues along which you look for people to talk to about what interests you, about what you care about, and so forth.
Okay. I think that how long have we got?
35 minutes.
Oh, well, I'm already over time, so we'll draw that to a
Very good.
conclusion. So
All right.
thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.